The restaurant looked like a place where only the richest people could step inside without feeling out of place. Soft golden lights reflected off polished marble floors, and every table was decorated with fresh flowers that seemed too perfect to be real. Gentle music usually filled the air, blending with quiet conversations and the soft clink of expensive glasses. Everything about the place spoke of elegance, comfort, and a life far removed from struggle. Among all of this, she moved quietly. Dressed in a simple uniform, she carried trays, served dishes, and cleared tables with steady hands. Her steps were careful, almost silent, as if she had trained herself not to disturb the calm atmosphere. To the guests, she was just part of the background, like the chairs or the curtains. They barely looked at her face. Some didn't look at her at all. She didn't mind. Or at least she had learned not to show that she did. Her day had started long before the restaurant opened. She woke up early, as always, in a small room that barely fit her bed and a tiny table near the window. The sunlight there was never as warm as the light in the restaurant. Felt distant, like something she could see but not fully feel. Still, she sat there for a few minutes every morning, holding a cup of tea and gathering her thoughts before the day rushed in. She had gotten used to this life. Simple routines. Long hours. Few words. But there was one thing she had never gotten used to. The quiet feeling inside her that something was missing. That feeling returned every evening when she stepped into the restaurant and saw the piano. It stood in the corner of the dining hall, shining under a soft spotlight. It wasn't just an instrument. It was like a piece of art. Smooth black surface, perfectly polished, reflecting everything around it. Some guests admired it from a distance, but most treated it like decoration. Only a few knew how special it really was. She always noticed it. Even when she was busy carrying plates or taking orders, her eyes would find their way to that piano. Just for a second. Sometimes less. But it was enough to bring a memory rushing back before she could stop it. A different room. A different life. A time when her hands didn't carry trays but moved across keys, creating music that made people stop and listen. She would quickly look away and return to her work, as if the thought itself was something she wasn't allowed to have anymore. That evening, the restaurant was especially busy. A group of wealthy guests had reserved the central tables, and everything needed to be perfect. The staff moved faster than usual, but still with grace. The manager walked around, checking every detail, making sure nothing went wrong. She stayed focused. A table needed water. Another needed menus. Someone asked for recommendations. Someone complained about the temperature of their soup. It was the usual flow of work, and she handled it all calmly. "Excuse me?" one guest said without even looking at her. "Can you be a bit quicker?" She nodded politely. Of course. There was no frustration in her voice. No sign that the words had any effect on her. But deep inside, she felt something small tighten for a moment. Not anger, not even sadness, just a reminder of where she stood in the eyes of others. Still, she kept going. As she passed by the piano again, she slowed down for a brief second. No one noticed. No one ever did. Her fingers tightened slightly around the tray she was holding, as if remembering a different weight, a different purpose. She imagined, just for a moment, what it would feel like to sit there again, to press a key, to hear a note fill the room. But the moment passed quickly. "Table 6, another staff member whispered, bringing her back. She nodded and moved on. The guests that night were dressed in fine clothes, speaking in low voices, laughing at things she couldn't hear. Some of them checked their phones often. Others leaned back in their chairs as if the world outside didn't exist. Their lives seemed so distant from hers that it almost felt like they belonged to a different world. Yet she moved among them easily. She had learned how to adjust her tone, her expressions, even her posture. She knew how to make people feel comfortable without drawing attention to herself. It was a skill she had built over time, just like everything else in her life now. But there was something they didn't see. Something she never showed. As the evening went on, the atmosphere started to feel slightly different. There was a gap in the usual flow. The music hadn't started yet. Normally, by this time, the pianist would already be playing soft melodies that filled the room and tied everything together. It was part of what made the place feel complete. But tonight, the piano remained silent. Some guests began to notice. "Isn't there usually music?" one of them asked. "Yes, there is," another replied, glancing toward the corner. The manager noticed the shift too. He checked his watch, then spoke quietly with another staff member. There was a hint of concern on his face, though he tried to hide it. She saw all of this while continuing her work. And once again, her eyes moved toward the piano. It looked different now. Not just beautiful, but lonely, as if it was waiting. She quickly looked away, but something inside her had already changed. The silence in the room felt louder than any sound. It reached her in a way she couldn't ignore. For the first time in a long while, her steps slowed not because she was tired, but because her thoughts were pulling her somewhere else. Back to a place she had tried to leave behind. Back to the feeling of sitting in front of a piano, not as a worker, but as someone who had something to say without speaking. She placed a dish carefully on a table and stepped back. "Thank you," the guest said casually, already turning back to their conversation. She nodded and moved on. But her mind was no longer fully there. The room continued as usual, orders being taken, plates being served, conversations flowing. But for her, everything felt slightly distant, like she was watching it from far away. And in the middle of it all, the silent piano remained. Waiting. She didn't know why it felt different tonight. Maybe it was the silence. Maybe it was the memory that refused to stay quiet. Or maybe it was something else. Something she couldn't fully understand yet. All she knew was that something inside her had started to wake up. Something she had kept hidden for a long time. She passed by the piano once more, closer this time. No one stopped her. No one even noticed how near she was to it. For a second, her hand almost lifted. Almost. But she stopped herself. Not here. Not like this. She took a slow breath and walked away again, returning to her duties as if nothing had happened. But deep down, she knew that something had shifted. The night was far from over. And for the first time in a long time, it felt like it might not be just another ordinary evening. The silence around the piano did not leave her mind, even as she continued moving between tables. It stayed with her like a soft echo, following her steps, slipping into her thoughts again and again. She tried to focus on her work, but something inside her had already been stirred, something she had kept quiet for a long time. She picked up a tray of empty glasses and walked toward the back area. The noise of the kitchen was louder, sharper, filled with quick voices and clattering dishes. It was a different world compared to the calm dining hall. Usually, this shift helped her reset, helped her forget whatever she was thinking about. But not tonight. She placed the glasses down and paused for a moment, her hands resting lightly on the counter. Her fingers moved slightly, almost without her noticing, tapping against the surface in a soft rhythm. It wasn't random. It was familiar. It was music. She stopped herself quickly, glancing around to make sure no one had noticed. A cook rushed past her, too busy to care. Another staff member called out an order. Everything was normal, except her. She straightened up, took a slow breath, and picked up the next set of dishes. But as she walked back into the dining area, the memory followed her. It didn't come all at once. Came in pieces. A small room with a window open just enough to let in fresh air. An old piano, not shiny or perfect like the one in the restaurant, but warm in its own way. Some keys were slightly worn, and the sound wasn't always clear, but to her, it had been everything. She remembered sitting there for hours, not because she was told to, but because she wanted to. Back then, time felt different. It moved quietly, gently, like the notes she played. There was no rush, no pressure from the outside world. Just her and the music. She remembered how her fingers used to move with confidence. Even when she made mistakes, she would laugh softly and try again. There was patience in those moments. There was joy. And there was hope. She had believed, in those days, that music would always be part of her life. But life doesn't always follow what we believe. "Are you all right?" a voice suddenly asked, pulling her back. She turned slightly. It was another staff member, holding a tray and looking at her with mild curiosity. "Yes," she replied quickly, offering a small smile. "Just a little tired." The other person nodded. "It's a busy night." She agreed and moved on, but the question lingered. Was she just tired? Or was it something else? She approached another table, placing dishes carefully in front of the guests. They thanked her politely, though their attention quickly returned to their conversation. She stepped back and moved away, her expression calm as always. But inside, the memories kept building. There had been a time when people listened to her. Not many, but enough. She remembered small gatherings where she played for others. Nothing grand, nothing like this restaurant, but real, honest. People would sit close, their faces soft with attention, not because they had to, but because they wanted to. She remembered the feeling of finishing a piece and hearing genuine applause. It wasn't loud or dramatic, but it was warm. It meant something. For a long time that had been enough. But then things changed. Life became heavier. Responsibilities came in quietly at first, then all at once. There were things that needed to be taken care of, situations that couldn't be ignored. Slowly, the time she once had for music began to disappear. At first, she told herself it was temporary. Just a short break. Just until things settled. But they never really did. The piano in that small room became silent more often. Days turned into weeks, weeks into months. Dust slowly gathered on its surface. The sound that once filled the space faded into memory. And one day, without any big moment or decision, she stopped playing altogether. Not because she didn't love it anymore, but because life had moved her somewhere else. A voice at the table brought her back again. "Miss, could we get some water?" "Of course," she said gently, reaching for the jug. Her movements were smooth, practiced. Anyone watching would see nothing unusual. Just a waitress doing her job well. No one would see the thoughts behind her eyes. No one would guess the life she had once imagined for herself. She moved from table to table, but the feeling inside her didn't fade. If anything, it grew stronger. The silent piano in the corner felt less like decoration now and more like a question she couldn't answer. Why did it still matter so much? She had accepted her life, hadn't she? She had learned to let go of what she couldn't keep. So why did the simple silence feel so loud? As she passed by the piano again, she slowed down slightly. The light above it made it shine softly, almost inviting. The seat in front of it was empty, untouched, waiting. Her chest tightened just a little. She looked away quickly and continued walking. In the distance, she noticed the manager speaking with someone again, his expression more tense now. The missing pianist was clearly becoming a problem. Some guests were beginning to shift in their seats, their conversations losing energy without the background music. The atmosphere wasn't as complete as it should have been, and she felt it more than anyone, because she knew what music could do. She knew how it could fill a space, change a mood, bring people together without a single word. She had seen it. She had been part of it. And now, standing there in her uniform, carrying plates and following routines, she felt the distance between who she was and who she had been. It wasn't anger. It wasn't regret in a heavy way. It was something quieter, a gentle ache. She stepped into the kitchen again, placing down another tray. This time, she didn't rush back out immediately. She stood there for a moment, her hands resting on the edge of the counter. Her fingers moved again, softly, pressing invisible keys. She closed her eyes for just a second, and in that brief moment, she could hear it. A melody, faint but clear enough. It wasn't coming from the room. It was coming from her. She opened her eyes quickly, almost surprised by it. Her heart was beating a little faster now. For so long, she had kept that part of herself quiet, pushed it aside, told it to wait. But tonight it didn't feel like waiting anymore. Felt like it was trying to return. She took a deep breath and straightened up again. Work was still there. Tables still needed attention. The night was still moving forward. But something inside her had shifted in a way she couldn't ignore. As she walked back into the dining hall, her eyes went to the piano once more. This time, she didn't look away immediately. She held her gaze for a moment longer. Not as someone passing by, but as someone remembering exactly what it felt like to belong there. Then she moved on again, carrying her tray, doing her job, blending back into the quiet flow of the restaurant. But now, the past didn't feel so far away. And the silence in the room didn't feel empty anymore. Felt like something waiting to be broken. The tension in the restaurant became more noticeable as the minutes passed. It wasn't loud or obvious, but it was there, quietly spreading through the room. Conversations were still happening, glasses still clinked, and food was still being served, yet something felt incomplete. The missing music had left a gap no one could ignore anymore. A few guests began to glance around more often. Some looked toward the piano, then toward the manager, as if expecting something to happen. Others leaned back in their chairs with a slight impatience, their voices a little sharper than before. She could feel it in the way people spoke. Shorter sentences, less warmth. Even the staff moved a little faster, as if trying to make up for what was missing. She carried a tray across the room, her focus steady, but her thoughts were no longer quiet. The feeling from earlier hadn't faded. If anything, it had grown stronger. The silence of the piano was no longer just something she noticed. It had become something she felt deeply. As she passed near the manager, she overheard a quiet conversation. "He's not coming," someone said in a low voice. The manager sighed, rubbing his forehead briefly. "Did he call?" No answer. For a moment, the manager said nothing. He looked toward the piano, then around the room. His expression stayed controlled, but the worry behind it was clear. "We can't leave it like this," he muttered. She slowed her steps slightly, just enough to hear, but not enough to draw attention. The other staff member shrugged. "What can we do?" The manager didn't respond right away. He adjusted his jacket and straightened his posture, trying to maintain the image of calm control. But the situation was slipping. She moved on, her heart beating just a little faster now. The words echoed in her mind. "He's not coming." The space at the piano suddenly felt even more noticeable. She reached a table and placed the dishes carefully, her hands steady as always. The guests thanked her, though one of them added, "It's a bit quiet tonight, isn't it?" She gave a polite smile. "We apologize for that." They nodded, but their expressions showed mild disappointment. She stepped away, but the comment stayed with her. A bit quiet. It was more than that. It was empty. She walked back toward the kitchen, but her steps slowed as she neared the piano again. This time, she didn't just glance at it. She stopped for a brief moment. No one was sitting there. No one was even near it. Stood alone, waiting. Her fingers tightened slightly around the tray she was holding. She could almost feel the smooth surface of the keys under her touch, even though she wasn't there. A thought appeared in her mind. Clear, simple, and impossible to ignore. What if she played? The idea felt sudden, almost shocking. She quickly shook her head and continued walking, as if trying to leave the thought behind. No, that wasn't her place anymore. She was here to serve, not to perform. She had left that part of her life behind. Hadn't she? She entered the kitchen and placed the tray down, her movements slightly quicker now. She tried to focus on the tasks in front of her, but her mind kept returning to that one thought. What if? It didn't go away. Instead, it grew stronger. She leaned lightly against the counter, taking a slow breath. Her heart was beating faster than before, not from work, but from something deeper. Fear, hope, uncertainty, all mixed together. "You okay?" Another staff member asked, noticing her pause. "Yes," she replied quickly, nodding. "Just catching my breath." The other person smiled and moved on. She stayed there for another second, then pushed herself to move again. She couldn't stand still, not with her thoughts like this. As she stepped back into the dining area, the atmosphere felt heavier. The guests were still polite, still composed, but the missing music had taken something away from the evening. She looked toward the manager again. He was standing near the entrance, speaking quietly with someone, but his eyes kept drifting toward the piano. He didn't know what to do, and for some reason she felt like she did. The thought returned, stronger this time. You could play. Her steps slowed again. Her eyes moved to the piano. Her heart beat faster. She tried to imagine it, walking over, sitting down, placing her hands on the keys. The image felt so real it almost made her stop breathing for a moment. But then another thought followed. What if she failed? What if her hands weren't the same anymore? What if she made a mistake in front of everyone? The room was full of people who expected perfection. People who were used to the best. She was just a waitress. Who would believe she could do something like that? Her chest tightened slightly. She looked down, focusing on the tray in her hands. It was safer this way. Quieter. Invisible. But the silence in the room pressed against her again. Stronger than before. And this time it didn't feel like something she could ignore. A guest's voice broke through her thoughts. "Excuse me, could you bring us another bottle?" "Yes, of course," she said gently. She turned and walked toward the storage area, but her mind wasn't fully there. Each step felt heavier now, as if she was carrying more than just her duties. She picked up the bottle and stood still for a moment before returning. This was her chance to forget the idea, to move on, to let the night pass like every other night. But something inside her resisted. As she walked back, she noticed the manager again. This time he looked more concerned. The pressure of the situation was showing. And without fully planning it, without giving herself time to overthink, her feet slowed as she approached him. She hesitated for a second, then another. Her heart was pounding now. This was a line she had never crossed before. But the words came out before she could stop them. "Sir." The manager turned, slightly surprised. "Yes." Her voice was calm, but there was a quiet strength behind it. "If you need someone to play." She paused for a brief moment, then continued. "I can try." For a second, the world seemed to stop. The manager looked at her, not fully understanding at first. "You?" he asked, more out of surprise than doubt. She nodded, keeping her posture steady. "Yes." There was no arrogance in her voice, no attempt to impress, just a simple offer. The manager studied her face for a moment, as if trying to see something he hadn't noticed before. "You can play the piano?" he asked. "Yes," she replied softly. He glanced toward the piano, then back at her. The situation was clear. They had no one else. The guests were waiting. The silence was growing heavier. Still, hesitation showed in his eyes. This was a risk. A big one. She understood that. "I won't disappoint," she added quietly. There was no pressure in her words, just honesty. Another moment passed. Then the manager took a slow breath. "All right," he said finally. It wasn't full confidence, but it was a chance. Her heart skipped a beat. She nodded once, respectfully. "Thank you." As she turned toward the piano, everything around her seemed to slow down. The sounds of the restaurant faded slightly. The voices became distant. Each step she took felt different now. Not like a waitress moving between tables, but like someone walking toward something she had lost a long time ago. The piano was right there, closer than it had ever been before. She reached it and paused. For a brief moment, doubt tried to return, but she didn't let it take over. She gently set aside the tray she was holding. Then slowly, she sat down. Her hands hovered above the keys. The room was still unaware. The guests hadn't fully noticed yet. But something was about to change. And for the first time in a long while, she wasn't walking away from it. She was stepping into it. For a few seconds after she sat down, nothing happened. The room was still filled with quiet conversation, the soft sound of cutlery, and low laughter. Most of the guests had not even noticed her move to the piano. To them, it was just another part of the restaurant, something they had already accepted as decoration for the evening. But for her, everything had changed. She sat straight, her hands hovering just above the keys. They were steady, but her heart was not. It beat fast, strong enough that she could feel it in her chest and even in her fingertips. It had been so long since she had sat like this, so long since she had allowed herself to come this close again. For a brief moment, doubt returned. What if her fingers forgot? What if the music inside her was no longer as clear as she remembered? What if the first note didn't sound right? She closed her eyes gently. Not for long. Just enough to breathe. In that small pause, the noise around her faded. The room, the guests, the expectations, all of it moved to the background. What remained was something simple. The memory of sound. The feeling of keys under her fingers. The quiet rhythm she had carried inside her for years. She opened her eyes again. And this time she didn't hesitate. Her fingers lowered, and she pressed the first key. The note was soft, but it was clear. It didn't rush or demand attention. It simply existed, calm and steady, like a small ripple in still water. She pressed another key, then another. The melody began slowly, almost gently, as if it was finding its way back to her as much as she was finding her way back to it. Each note followed the next with natural ease, not forced, not perfect, but honest. At first, only a few people noticed. A guest sitting closest to the piano turned their heads slightly, curiosity catching their attention. Another paused mid-sentence, listening for a second before continuing their conversation. But the sound didn't stop. It grew. Not louder, but deeper. Her hands moved more freely now. The hesitation that had been there moments ago began to fade. The music flowed with more confidence, each note connecting smoothly to the next. It wasn't just a melody anymore. It was a story. And slowly, the room began to feel it. Conversations started to soften. Voices lowered without anyone asking them to. One by one, heads turned toward the piano. There was something different about this music. It didn't feel like background sound. It felt alive. The manager, standing near the entrance, looked over as well. His expression shifted from concern to surprise. He hadn't expected this. Not like this. She continued playing, unaware of how many eyes were now on her. Or maybe she was aware, but it didn't matter anymore. Because in that moment, she wasn't playing for them. She was playing for herself. For the part of her that had been silent for so long. Her fingers moved with growing confidence, dancing across the keys in a way that felt both natural and powerful. The music carried emotion that didn't need words. It spoke of quiet strength, of lost time, of something that had been hidden but never truly gone. The guests were no longer talking. They were listening. Some leaned forward slightly in their chairs. Others sat completely still, their attention fully captured. Even those who had seemed uninterested earlier now found themselves drawn in without understanding why. It wasn't just skill. It was feeling. And that was something they couldn't ignore. A woman at one table placed her glass down slowly, her eyes fixed on the pianist. A man who had been checking his phone moments earlier now held it still in his hand. Forgotten. The room had changed. Completely. The silence that had once felt empty was now full. Full of sound, of emotion, of something real. Her breathing had steadied. Her heart no longer raced with fear. Instead, it moved with the rhythm of the music. Each note felt like a step forward, each phrase like a piece of herself returning. She wasn't thinking about mistakes anymore. She wasn't thinking about the guests or the manager or what might happen next. She was simply playing. And it showed. The melody began to rise, becoming more expressive, more powerful. Her hands moved faster now, but still controlled, still precise. It wasn't rushed. It was guided by something deeper than practice. It was guided by memory, by everything she had once felt and never truly lost. The guests felt it too. There was a quiet understanding in the room now. A shared moment that didn't need explanation. They had expected a simple evening. Nothing more than good food and polite conversation. But this was something else. Something they didn't see coming. The manager took a few steps closer, his eyes never leaving her. The doubt he had felt earlier was gone. In its place was something closer to disbelief. How had he not known? How had he not seen this before? But those questions didn't matter right now. What mattered was the music. As she continued, the melody softened again, returning to something gentle, almost fragile. It was like a quiet conversation after a long silence. A moment of reflection, of calm after intensity. Her fingers slowed, pressing each key with care, letting the sound linger just a little longer. The room followed her. No one spoke. No one moved unnecessarily. Even the staff stood still when they could, watching from a distance. Time felt different in that moment. Slower. More meaningful. She reached the final part of the piece. There was no grand build-up, no dramatic ending. Just a quiet, beautiful closing. Her fingers pressed the last few notes, soft and steady, letting them fade naturally into the silence that followed. And then, she stopped. Her hands rested lightly on the keys for a second before she lifted them. The room remained silent. Not empty this time, but full. Full of everything they had just experienced. For a brief moment, no one moved. It was as if the music was still there, hanging in the air, not ready to leave just yet. Then, slowly, someone began to clap. One pair of hands. Then another. And another. Within seconds, the entire room filled with applause. Not polite, not forced. Real. Strong. Unexpected. She looked up slightly, her expression calm but her eyes carrying something deeper. She hadn't expected this. She hadn't played for this. But there it was. The sound of appreciation. The kind she remembered. The kind that meant something. She stood up slowly from the piano, her movements quiet again, just like before. But nothing was the same, because now, everyone was looking at her. Not as a waitress, but as someone they hadn't noticed until this very moment. And they were seeing her clearly for the first time. The applause did not stop quickly. It continued, strong and steady, filling every corner of the restaurant in a way that felt completely different from the music that had just ended. This sound was louder, more open, and full of emotion that no one was trying to hide. The guests were no longer holding back their reactions. Some were smiling, some were still in quiet shock, and a few even shook their heads slightly, as if they still couldn't believe what they had just witnessed. She stood beside the piano, unsure of what to do next. Her hands, which had just moved so confidently across the keys, now rested quietly at her sides. She wasn't used to being the center of attention like this anymore. For a moment, she almost felt like stepping back, like returning to the quiet role she had held before. But she didn't move. She simply stood there, taking in the moment without fully understanding it. The manager approached her slowly, his expression no longer tense but filled with surprise and something close to respect. He looked at her for a moment, as if trying to find the right words. That was... He paused, letting out a small breath. I didn't expect that. She gave a small, polite nod. Thank you. There was no pride in her voice, just calm honesty. Around them, the guests were still reacting. A few had already stood up from their tables. One of them stepped closer, followed by another. Within seconds, a small group had gathered near the piano. Where did you learn to play like that? One guest asked, his voice filled with curiosity. She hesitated for a brief moment before answering. A long time ago. It wasn't a full answer, but it was the truth. Another guest spoke, this time with a softer tone. You play like someone who never stopped. She didn't respond immediately, because that wasn't true. She had stopped. For a long time, but maybe not completely. I used to play often, she said quietly. The group exchanged glances, clearly wanting to know more. There was something about her performance that made them feel connected, even though they didn't know her story. One of the guests, an older woman with a calm presence, stepped forward slightly. You should be on a stage, not serving tables, she said gently. The words were kind, but they carried weight. She looked down for a second, then back up. Life doesn't always go the way we plan. There was no bitterness in her voice, just acceptance. The guests seemed to understand that. The manager was still standing nearby, listening carefully. His view of her had changed completely. Just an hour ago, she had been part of the staff he managed without much thought. Now he was seeing her in a way he hadn't before. You never told me you could play, he said. She gave a small smile. It never seemed important. He shook his head slightly, almost in disbelief. It's more than important. For a moment, neither of them said anything. The guests continued to speak among themselves, their voices filled with admiration. Some returned to their tables, but their attention didn't fully leave her. They kept looking back, still drawn to what they had just experienced. One man, who had been sitting quietly during most of the evening, finally stood up and walked toward her. His steps were slow but confident. There was something thoughtful in his expression, something that suggested he had been paying close attention from the beginning. "You have something rare," he said, stopping a short distance away. She looked at him, unsure how to respond. "It's not just skill," he continued. "It's feeling. Not everyone can do that." She nodded slightly. "Thank you." He studied her for a moment, then asked, "Why did you stop?" The question was simple, but it reached deeper than anything else that had been said so far. She didn't answer right away, because the answer wasn't simple. She glanced briefly at the piano, then back at him. "Things changed," she said softly. "I had other responsibilities." He didn't push further. He simply nodded, as if he understood more than she had said. "Do you still play?" he asked. She paused again. The honest answer was clear now. "Not until tonight," she said. There was a quiet silence between them for a moment. Then he gave a small, knowing smile. "Well, I'm glad you did." Around them, the atmosphere of the restaurant had completely transformed. What had once been a formal, distant environment now felt warmer, more connected. Guests spoke to each other with more openness, as if the music had broken something invisible between them. Even the staff seemed different. A few of them looked at her with quiet admiration, their expressions softer than before. They had worked alongside her for so long, yet they hadn't known this side of her either. She became aware of all the eyes again, not in an uncomfortable way, but in a way that felt new. For years, she had moved through places unnoticed, her presence quiet and easy to overlook. Now she was being seen, truly seen, and it felt unfamiliar. The manager cleared his throat gently. "We should continue service," he said, though his tone was lighter now. "But," he paused, looking at her, "if you're willing, you can play again later." She blinked slightly, surprised by the offer. "Only if you want to," he added quickly. She looked at the piano once more, then back at him. "I'll think about it," she said. He nodded, understanding. The guests slowly returned to their tables, but the energy in the room remained different. There was a quiet excitement now, a shared memory that connected them all. She stepped away from the piano, picking up her tray again. For a moment it felt strange. Just minutes ago, she had been sitting at the piano, creating something that filled the entire room. Now she was returning to her role, moving between tables, carrying dishes. But something had changed, not in the work, but in how it felt. As she approached a table, the guests looked up at her with new expressions. "Your performance was beautiful," one of them said. "Thank you," she replied softly. Another added, "We didn't expect that at all." She smiled slightly. "Neither did I." They laughed gently, and the moment felt easy, natural. She continued her work, but now every step carried a different kind of awareness. The quiet part of her that had been hidden for so long was no longer invisible. It had been seen, heard, felt, and even though she was still doing the same job, nothing felt quite the same anymore. As she passed by the piano again, she slowed down for just a second. This time, she didn't look at it with distance. She looked at it with recognition, like something that had always belonged to her, even when she had tried to leave it behind. The night continued, the restaurant slowly returning to its rhythm, but the impact of what had happened stayed in the air. And deep inside her, something that had been quiet for years was no longer silent. It was awake, and it wasn't going back to sleep. The night did not return to how it had been before. Even though the guests went back to their tables and the staff continued their duties, there was a quiet energy in the air that hadn't been there earlier. It was softer, warmer, and somehow more real. Conversations flowed again, but now they carried a different tone. People spoke with more attention, more presence, as if the music had reminded them of something they had forgotten. She moved through the room with her tray, just like before. But inside, nothing felt the same. Every step she took now felt lighter, even though her responsibilities had not changed. She still served food, still cleared tables, still responded politely to every request. but there was a quiet confidence in her movements that hadn't been there earlier. It wasn't something others could easily describe, but they could feel it. Some guests continued to stop her gently as she passed by. "That was truly something special," one said. "You have a gift," another added. She thanked each of them with the same calm smile, not letting the attention overwhelm her. But every word reached her in a way that mattered. Not because they were praising her, but because they were seeing a part of her she had hidden for so long. Later in the evening, the manager approached her again. "If you're ready," he said, glancing toward the piano, "you can play another piece." She looked at him for a moment. There was no pressure in his voice this time, only respect. She nodded slowly. "I will." The decision felt simple now. Not heavy, not frightening, just right. She finished serving the table she was attending to and placed her tray aside. As she walked toward the piano again, she noticed how the room responded. Conversations softened once more, guests turning their attention in her direction with quiet anticipation. This time they were ready, and so was she. She sat down at the piano, her posture calm, her hands steady. There was no hesitation now, no fear trying to hold her back. The doubt that had once been there had faded, replaced by something stronger. Trust, not in the audience, but in herself. Her fingers touched the keys again, and the music began. This time it was different. The first performance had been about returning, about finding something she thought she had lost. But this one felt like moving forward. The notes came with more clarity, more strength, carrying not just memory but purpose. The melody flowed smoothly, filling the room with a sense of calm and quiet joy. Guests listened closely, some with small smiles, others with closed eyes, letting the music take them somewhere beyond the walls of the restaurant. It wasn't just entertainment anymore. It was a moment they would remember. The staff paused when they could, watching from a distance. The manager stood still, arms gently crossed, his attention fixed on her, and she played. Not for approval, not for recognition, but because it felt right. When she reached the end of the piece, the room once again fell into that same quiet stillness before the applause began. This time it came even faster, even stronger, but she didn't feel overwhelmed by it. She accepted it with a calm heart. She stood up slowly, giving a small nod of appreciation before stepping away from the piano. The manager approached her again, a thoughtful look on his face. "You've changed the entire evening," he said. She shook her head gently. "The music did." He smiled slightly. "And you gave it life." For a moment they stood in silence. Then he added, "If you ever want to play here, not as staff, but as a performer, we can make that happen." The words were simple, but they carried meaning. Real possibility. She looked at him, surprised, but not in the same way as before. This time, the surprise felt softer, mixed with something she hadn't allowed herself to feel in a long time. "Hope. I'll think about it," she said quietly. He nodded. "Take your time." As the night slowly moved toward its end, the guests began to leave one by one. Many of them stopped by the piano area before going, offering a few final words. "Don't stop playing. You belong there. We hope to hear you again." Each comment stayed with her, not as pressure, but as encouragement. When the last guests had gone and the restaurant grew quiet again, she found herself standing near the piano once more. The lights were softer now, the space calm and still, the same place where everything had changed. She reached out slowly and touched the edge of the piano, her fingers resting lightly against its smooth surface. It no longer felt distant. It no longer felt like something from another life. It felt close, real, like it had been waiting for her, just as much as she had been holding on to it without realizing. Behind her, the staff began cleaning up, their voices low and relaxed. The manager walked past, giving her a small nod before continuing on. She stood there for another moment, letting the silence settle around her. But this silence was different. It wasn't empty anymore. It was peaceful, full in its own quiet way. She thought about everything that had happened that night. The hesitation, the fear, the first note, the way the room had changed, and the way she had changed with it. For so long, she had believed that part of her life was over, that it belonged to the past, something she could remember but never return to. But tonight had shown her something else. It had shown her that some things don't disappear. They wait, quietly, patiently, until the moment you are ready to find them again. She took a slow breath and stepped back from the piano. There was still work to do. The night wasn't completely finished. But now, the future didn't feel as fixed as it once had. There were possibilities she hadn't allowed herself to see before. Paths she hadn't considered walking again. As she picked up her tray and began helping with the final tasks, there was a small, steady feeling inside her. Not excitement, not uncertainty, but something stronger. Clarity. She didn't have all the answers yet. She didn't know exactly what would come next. But she knew one thing for sure. She wasn't going to ignore that part of herself anymore. The part that played. The part that felt. The part that had come alive again. And as the lights in the restaurant dimmed and the doors prepared to close, she carried that quiet promise with her. Not as a dream, but as something real. Something she was finally ready to follow.